This is Chris Hedges and Lee Camp. Now, they discussed a number of topics during this interview, but the one I wanted to focus on is what Chris Hedges says about war. I think this is important. If you guys don't know, Chris Hedges, obviously, he's covered multiple wars. Like, as a journalist, he's been there, like, on the ground. And so I'm pretty sure he's seen some disturbing things, like, just to be honest with you here. But he's going to talk a little bit about that. And I want you to pay attention to some of the things that he says here. I thought this was a really good discussion. And this is actually on Mint Press News. I'm not sure if it's on Lee Camp's channel or not, but I saw it on Mint Press News.
You really didn't get a sense. I mean, this has been true in every conflict I've ever covered. I mean, for instance, I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and the Iraqis who had been cut off from their water for several days were desperate to get water, and they would walk out into the minefields and they'd blow their legs off. You can survive several hours, unfortunately, with your legs blown off, screaming for help. I mean, in real time, we could have set up a satellite feed to show you that, but that's never going to happen. So we don't see war, and the media does a pretty good job of feeding, which they're doing in Ukraine, the mythic narrative of war. It's become a battle of light against dark, a good against evil.
I just want to chime in here in reference to what he said about the casualties, like the physical casualties that happen at war. If I remember correctly, the last time that was actually shown where you saw like women and children being like, blown up, gotta be careful on the sound here, but like blown up or blown to pieces or things like that, was the Vietnam War. I think that was the last time they let mainstream media cameras cover that type of content. And since the Vietnam War, they didn't let you come back in and do that. And that's why it's important to have like the investigative journalists that are on the ground, like someone like a Chris Hedges or someone like a Vanessa Beeley, to cover the things that the cameras won't let you come in and get anymore. So they're able to cover it as independent journalists and give that information back to us. But it's really important that people understand that after the Vietnam War, even when mainstream media and CNN, when they go over there, notice they don't cover the casualties. They don't put that on video anymore. And I think part of that was done because of, well, censorship. Some people may have felt it was too graphic for people to see, but also it sends a message about the reality of war and what actually happens to the civilians. So there's that part too.
Putin is the new Hitler. Doesn't cover conflict a long time. Both sides lie like they breathe, and war is a very dirty business. So I was glad I put it out just to remind people of what war actually is. And of course, the cynicism of the war in Ukraine, where we're going to destroy the country and make every Ukrainian, or hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainians bleed to death. For what? I mean, they're going to have to negotiate in the end. But it's not about Ukraine. It's not about democracy. It's not about freedom. It's about degrading Russia. I mean, that's
a good point there that he added. Joe Biden has said so himself. Well, they'll be fighting until the last Ukrainian is standing. For what? Like when he says that, does anyone like pick up on that? Like, for what? What's the point if everybody's dead? What do you win if everybody look around and everyone's dead? What do you get? Do you get any territory? Do you get extra land? Like, what exactly do you get if you're dead? So then you have to ask yourself this question. If you start with that, you have to follow up with this question. Then what's the point of it? What is it all for? Why are you still going if you know you're going to have to negotiate at some point anyway? Then you have to remember that war is a profitable industry. There's a lot of money to be made with war. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, the weapons manufacturers, they make a lot of money from war. if we don't have war, some of those companies would probably have some massive layoffs, even though Raytheon does layoffs anyway. But think about it. Would they exist? Would those companies exist? Something to marinate on there a little bit.
Actually, if you look closely, they're even upfront about it. So I was glad I put the book out just to remind people of the enterprise of death that war is, and what it does to human beings, what it does to families, what it does to societies, and the price that and never-ending price for many that you have to pay when you go to war.
That's right.
Yeah, the cheerleading for what seems to be endless or ongoing war in Ukraine is kind of amazing. I know the word Orwellian is thrown around a lot these days, but it feels very Orwellian to me to watch so many liberals across America, wave Ukrainian flags and act like they stand for Ukraine, when really what the politicians who want them to hold those flags and the point at the core of that is, let's keep this thing going and keep just funding and arming people. And, the U.S. and UK through Boris Johnson helped end any peace talks back in April. So it really is. We're at a place where now peace, standing for peace equals war, or standing for war equals peace.
Well, this isn't any different than the Bush's call to invade Iraq. I mean, I'd come into the newsroom at the New York Times and the message bank on my phone would be full of death threats, and the only reason there weren't more is because they ran out of room. And nationalism is a disease. I saw it. I saw the poison of it around the world, and it's the flip side of nationalism is always bigotry and racism, but it's also self-exaltation. I mean, all of this so much, especially after the humiliating defeat in Afghanistan and the debacles in Iraq and Syria and Libya. It's a way for us to resurrect our purity, our moral superiority, our goodness. This has nothing to do really with Ukraine. Most Americans couldn't find Ukraine on a map. It is about the celebration of us as a virtuous, a good people and a powerful people. And that is a real sickness. It's a sickness that I saw with the wars in the Middle East, and it's the same sickness that we're seeing now. It's also historically, it's a way to willfully ignore our own provocations to Russia. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I was acutely aware of the promises made to Moscow not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany.
And let's just go back here for a second, because that's really what a lot of this comes down to. Expanding NATO, which was not supposed to happen. Okay, this isn't like an opinion or anything like that. Like, that was not supposed to happen after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it happened anyway. So that's what a lot of this goes back to, this tension, the war that we're seeing right now. The expansion of NATO brought us to this point.
Not to station NATO troops. We now have 100,000 NATO troops or something in Eastern and Central Europe. And that was really done not for security reasons, because Gorbachev wanted to build a security and economic alliance with Europe and the United States, as did Yeltsin, and people forget, as did Putin in the early years. It was about the belief in this arrogant, hubristic, unipolar world, i.e. after the Cold War, we, the United States, would dominate the globe. And of course, Russia was weakened and crippled and no longer seemed to be a factor that the military establishment had to take into account. And it was also about billions in arms profits, because you have to reconfigure these Soviet bloc armies with NATO-compatible equipment. So it's billions and billions and billions in arms sales. So those were the two reasons. It was not in our security interest. I fully believe that Russia would not have, I'm not excusing it, by the way, preemptive war, which this is a criminal war of aggression. But I fully believe that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine if we had not expanded NATO. And I think
that's right. And so people who will come to you and say, who invaded who? They leave that piece out. It's something I've noticed, like they leave that piece out, right? So you can't be like, I'm sorry, like I'm not trying to roll with the whole like pro NATO narrative, like people supporting that. The squad supports that, by the way. The progressives in Congress support that.
Especially given Russia's history, it was invaded through Ukraine twice in the last century, first in World War I, second in World War II, the century before that, of course, by Napoleon. There is historical trauma, legitimate historical trauma, and I think they have every right to ask that Ukraine remain a neutral country. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. Even the New York Times has said that the idea that we're going to recapture all of Ukrainian territory, including among the ethnically Russian sections of Ukraine, is folly. These are the New York Times words, not mine. But the war industry, which just leaps from debacle to debacle to debacle, is never held accountable. The pimps of war, the Robert Kagans and Elliot Abrams and Victoria Nuland's, it doesn't matter. I mean, Victoria Nuland was Cheney's foreign policy advisor. Now she was in the Obama White House. She's in the Biden White House.
And we all know that Dick Cheney was very, very much pro-war. Another warmonger. But the point that Chris Hedges is saying here is that it doesn't matter which party she was under at the time. It doesn't matter which administration she was under at the time. The goal is still the same. So she can work for Dick Cheney and then she can go work for Barack Obama. It doesn't matter. The goal is still the same because both parties are pro-war. That's how someone like Victoria Nuland can do that. And I wish more people paid attention to that. Right? Because if both parties weren't pro-war, then why would she go to work for Barack Obama? She's able to do that because he was pro-war also.
These people are just utterly protean, and they're never held to account because they're funded by the war industry. Their think tanks are funded by the war industry. That's why they always have a media platform. I dealt with Abrams and Robert Kagan when I covered the war in El Salvador. They were out working out of the State Department under the Reagan administration, and their primary job was to attempt to discredit everything we were reporting off the ground. That was their job, and they you can't get rid of them. I mean, they're like some anti-virus bacterial strain that never goes away. I mean, the whole lead up to the war in Iraq, I had to listen to these people who knew nothing about the Middle East. I'd been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I speak Arabic. I'd spent months of my life in Iraq. I certainly know the instrument of war, but if you didn't parrot back that dominant narrative, you were shut out. Didn't matter how.
And that's still happening today. And that's still happening today. If you don't have that mainstream narrative about war, conflict that's going on abroad, you will be censored. You will be shut out. They would try to make it so that no one can find you or follow you, right? So that they don't hear that narrative. And I think it's important for people to hear both perspectives. You need to be able to pull the bullshit out of mainstream media and fill it with some of the information that comes from independent media. People need to be, you got to let the American people do their own thinking. And from what I've seen, it appears a lot of these platforms don't want American people to do that. Like they're like, oh, that's not the right information. Oh, that's not the mainstream narrative. So we're going to censor it so that people can't see it. Let the American people think for themselves. But hiding the information and preventing them from seeing it, that's bullshit.
How much expertise you had. So the very people they present as quote unquote experts come out of the war industry or the intelligence community. And of course, they're highly paid for this. They're all sitting on the board.
You can see the rest, the full interview, because like I said, they don't just talk about war. They talk about other topics too, like Joe Biden and the midterms and things like that. You can see it on, It's called Chris Hedges and Lee Camp. War is the greatest evil. Thank you so much for that, Eric. Eric has put that link there in the chat, so you can watch the entire interview, because I think it's a little bit over an hour if you want to see the full interview. But definitely check that out. Really good stuff there. Now, I think, you know, something that's really important that we just got to say here in reference to this type of information, it's important that we have sites like Substack, right? So that Chris Hedges has a place where he can write. Because Substack, for the most part, they don't care. I mean, Substack, you can put a lot of things up on Substack. For the most part, I haven't seen them go after people that way. So it's important that you have that. It's important that you have other platforms besides YouTube, that you have a Rockfin, that you have a Rumble, that you have an Odyssey, so that people can talk about those issues. Some of the best content that I have seen in reference to war is on Rockfin, believe it or not. So there are shows on there that are only on there and are not on YouTube for that reason, because of the censorship. So I definitely, if you're not on Rockfin, definitely check out Rockfin if you want to hear a different perspective in reference to war. Definitely check that out. But great conversation there. Definite shout out.